I know, provocative thumbnail, fat nerd on your screen. What are you going to do? Hello again, I am Blunty. So today I'd like to do something I'm rarely able to do. Share with you some cut content, a fat chunk of notes that didn't quite make it through the edit process of a couple of other videos I've tried to make, and it's something I've been trying to find a way to frame up and fold in for a while now. So let's just dive into the meat here and see if I can get it right this time. I think I'm close. Very close. Now, I remember when Enterprise first came out. Fun fact, a lot of less than hardcore fans might not know, it wasn't even called Star Trek Enterprise for the first half of its 4-season run, initially in the hopes of making it more appealing to people who didn't really see themselves as nerdy Trekkies. It was just called Enterprise. And they just went to, they went to efforts to bait viewership. I can relate. But the naming scheme really didn't work, so in season 3 they changed its name to Star Trek Enterprise to try and bring people in. Oh, it's a Star Trek show. I know about Star Trek, I've heard of that before, maybe it's worth watching. They also changed up how they were telling the stories, just from a writing process view as well. And like Strange New Worlds, Enterprise was made as a prequel series, set before the original series, which meant it was under tremendous scrutiny not to F up with the continuity and established lore that we already knew would follow it afterwards, chronologically speaking. Set aboard the first of its kind ship, powered by Earth's first Warp 5 engine, and the first to enable Earth to properly start exploring the galaxy before the Federation even existed. It was an interesting concept. I liked a lot about it, the ship design especially, the interior design in particular. It really sold it as sort of unpolished and built for purpose, engineering first, aesthetic second. It had a strong cast, it had interesting characters, and a nice dynamic going amongst the crew. There was a lot to like. But when it first released originally, I and a vocal chunk of the fandom didn't really like it much. We didn't react well. It was criticised heavily as not being real Star Trek. Hi, Discovery fans, did you think you were the first ones? No, not even close. And this was pre-Kurtzman era too. It was criticised for many things, a lot of which would sound familiar to newer fans who came on board with the modern era of the last half-decade or so, not least of which not being real Trek. Among many complaints, criticisms, and issues were the fact that certain characters of familiar alien heritage, well, they just seemed off. But either by plan or by corrective writing and retconning due to fan backlash, they actually became favourite characters for at least some of us. Captain Archer had a very interesting arc of character growth. I really enjoyed him quite a lot, but I speak now of T'Pol. That's why she was in the thumbnail, not just because she's really sexy. To me and many others, she was an extremely polarizing character amongst the fandom, and not just because her casting was a very cynical attempt to do what Voyager did with Seven of Nine, who was herself introduced mid-run and cast by open admission of the production primarily for sex appeal. She was there because she was sexy. But past the male-gazy cynicism of TV production, it was more of an issue of her characters when it came to T'Pol. She was Vulcan, but her emotions were much more exposed than a Vulcan should be, and a lot of fans really hated that. She was an extremely atypical Vulcan, and it wasn't reacted to well. That is not what a Vulcan should be, came the outcry from fans. I was one of those Trek fans. I mean, I wasn't out there on message boards losing my poops and raging about it, but I really didn't like T'Pol or how she was being written. And at first, I even blamed Jolene Blalock for her performance as T'Pol, thinking that she just didn't understand what a Vulcan even is, or maybe she's just too crappy an actor to perform with the kind of subtlety other actors in pointy prosthetics had achieved before her. It was hardly a secret they cast her a model from the pages of magazines like FHM and Maxim / actress for her aesthetic appearance, not purely based on her acting chops. I was wrong about Jolene, by the way. She is in fact a good actor, a very good actor, in fact, as some of the later episodes, more focused on T'Pol, would reveal her to be. Eventually, they explored the issue of T'Pol and her Vulcanility directly within the show. In season 4, episode 3, Home, her mother even comments on how T'Pol's emotions had always been closer to the surface and how she had more trouble than the average Vulcan had in suppressing them. In the same episode, we also see T'Pol struggle with conforming to Vulcan traditions, primarily an arranged marriage. This episode comes after several other episodes that show T'Pol sort of struggling with conforming to Vulcan ideals, both philosophically and sort of personally as well. In some episodes, even finding herself uncomfortably trying to uphold these ideals against other Vulcans who have more completely rejected them, not because she unwaveringly believes in them, but she knows that's what's expected of her, and she has been conditioned to trust in. But not least of all was an arc in which we were shown that T'Pol was never all that comfortable with, or even all that good at, Vulcan emotional suppression. Again, folding herself into tradition and obligation and conditioning, rather than personal choice and personal agency. T'Pol had started using a chemical substance found to have a deleterious effect on Vulcan neurobiology to allow her to break her emotional conditioning more freely, because she liked how it felt, and how emotional experience let her connect more easily with the crew, how social interaction came more naturally, how much better she was received by others when she was dosing. It was, of course, a metaphor for a few things, most obviously destructive drug abuse and the potential problems with self-medicating. Eventually, she was left with irreversible damage to parts of her brain, permanently disrupting her ability to emotionally regulate in the way Vulcans would normally, and where continued use of the neurotoxin would most certainly kill her, so she had to stop. Enterprise is few Trekkies' favourite show, but over the years I've rewatched the whole run quite a few times now, and every time I do, I enjoy it just a little bit more, having more context for things as they unfold, knowing that things like T'Pol's unusual emotional displays early on had an in-universe and on-screen explanation. It kind of helped me accept the initially jarring presentation of a Vulcan, so obviously atypical. But more and more I started to like T'Pol, not just because her unusual behavior for a Vulcan had an explanation, which made her easy to accept on screen, but because I began to relate to her, especially after my autism diagnosis gave me my own context and for my behavioral atypicality. T'Pol was, in effect, deliberately written or not, a neurodivergent Vulcan. And instead of accepting her because it was explained why she was a bit different, she's always been that way, I accepted her because she was different, not in spite of it. Just like the way my brain is very literally physically and biologically wired differently than the average human brain is, so too could T'Pol be interpreted that way pretty friggin' easily. Even more so than Vulcans usually can. So, like I mentioned, I'm autistic, and I also experience bipolar disorder, the two mixed together in some pretty unique ways to affect many things about how I think and how I experience life. One of the less subtle ways they team up is in my emotional experience and empathic response. I've been a Star Trek fan for a lot longer than I've had these diagnoses. Diagnoses? But I've always related to certain Trek aliens quite a bit more than a lot of some other Trek fans I've spoken with about this tend to do. Except, of course, for my fellow neurodivergent peeps. Of course, we all relate to them in some way. That's their purpose. That's why they're written that way. Almost every alien species we see on screen, and certainly the ones we see most often, is some reflection of some aspect of humanity. Our logic, our self-control, our aggression, our greed, our empathy, our annoying mate who just can't take a friggin' clue to save themselves. Sometimes I frame up my autistic experience as being a bit Vulcan, as you may have assumed I was going to get to here. But I'm not even close to being alone on that bridge either. For me, it's the Vulcan obsession with self-control and logic and analytical flow. Things need to be ordered, precise, and in such careful organization of facts, we are able to have things that follow be logically anticipated. Having a logical flow or order of facts and experience allows for prediction, and being able to calculate and predict things like other people is a key skill for many autistic people. Especially since we have to do that kind of manually and not just rely on however it is normal people flow through social interactions seemingly on autopilot. Vulcans mask, just like we do. They suppress, conform, and make tremendous and constant mental effort to resist the rawest and most difficult to control impulses flowing inside them. Vulcans are in fact much more powerfully emotional than humans are, and the severity of their emotional experience is cranked up significantly above what is considered normal in humans. We've seen this on screen more than a couple of times when, for whatever sci-fi reason, their control is broken or hampered or removed from them. Their intensity of emotion, either positive or negative emotion, is always seen as a problem for their human crewmates, and unacceptable divergence from expected behavior, something to be wary of, something to be worried about. A Vulcan's mental discipline, their philosophy, their many systems of emotional suppression and mental control are all there to prevent them succumbing to the overwhelming nature of their natural ability for emotional regulation. Before, in what they call the time of awakening, they were without this philosophy of logic and peace and self-control, and they very nearly self-destructed as a people. It's a thin allegory for humanity's own instinct for aggressive and destructive tribalism and violence. It's not a perfect personal metaphor for me, but I relate to it powerfully and always have. My empathic response is way harder to control than a neurotypical person's tends to be, and my emotions are much harder to filter and control and express in a way that neurotypicals would expect or accept usually. Long before my diagnosis, I knew it already. I saw it in myself when I saw how other people acted, and I had no idea why my experience seemed to be so different from theirs. And just like the Vulcans I saw on screen, I had to make a deliberate and careful and constant effort to mask that, to suppress and control it, because to do otherwise, it causes issues. It's always a constant, deliberate effort. It's not natural to me. It doesn't come easy. And it's pretty exhausting, mentally and even physically, to do for extended periods. And in fact, quite harmful to my own mental health to do it constantly. For many years, I did it so constantly, all day, every day. My mental health suffered tremendously, like really. Because see, it's not just the emotional control stuff that makes me relate to Vulcans. It's also the social stuff that we see them go through and struggle with. In every typical Vulcan we see on screen, they rely on logic. It's the one keyword for their species. You say Vulcan, you think logic. They use logic and their outsider understanding of human behavior to predict how a conversation or situation will go with their non-Vulcan shipmates. They have logical structures, organized steps of reactions and expectations and anticipation that things must and will go how logic dictates it will, because it's obvious. That's how it makes sense. They can be calm and reassured because things are going how they're supposed to go. It's fine. But when humans act outside of predictable expectations, driven by a reactive emotional outburst or gut feelings and guesswork, or instinct and conjecture, it throws all of that carefully organized structure right out the airlock, and it becomes much more difficult to understand and interact with them. It becomes a mental slog to process what's going on, and they will understand you less because of that. The system has failed, so now everything has to be manually observed and manually processed in isolation of itself. It's hard, it's agonizing, it's antagonizing, it's confusing, and it makes thinking in the normal way impossible. There's just not enough structure. It's all flawed and broken logic. There's no room left. And it's at these moments, almost exclusively these moments, we see the mask on a Vulcan crack and fall. Their exasperation flickers through, because in all this horrific chaos, there's too much to process, which leaves less mental focus to keep up the mask. Spock was half human, so for him, it's a bit more frequent and varied. A smirk, a cocked eyebrow, a shadow of sarcasm spat across the room, a flicker of self-satisfaction. For Tuvok, a much more typical Vulcan, it was rarer for it to show overtly, at least outside of a passive-aggressive remark often in the direction of the emotionally driven Ensign Kim. But even Tuvok could be seen on occasion nearing his limits with the extremely extroverted and emotionally unfiltered Neelix especially. Almost the polar antithesis of a Vulcan. Everything was unfiltered emotion with that guy. Impulse, self-centered irreverence, and whim. I feel you, Tuvok. And it's in this way I actually find T'Pol more relatable than Tuvok, who was a very staunch and typical Vulcan. See, unlike Vulcans in general, I'm not inherently dangerous or violent without my masking. If I let my emotional control drop, I don't fly into a ridiculous rage trying to destroy everything or take over the ship. I do it for the comfort of others, to help social situations go more smoothly so I don't upset or make other people uncomfortable or confused in what they logically expect from a normal social interaction. I do it to make other people's day easier. And I do it so I don't stand out and become judged. Because a lot of people, even those who think themselves liberal and open-minded and accepting, still do seem to have a lot of issues when it comes to someone like me dropping the mask and being a bit too extra for them. Just like a human shipmate will be inherently and instantly confused and worried about a Vulcan if they start drifting from the expectation of their mask at all. A single tear is enough to worry some people. Dipole was more like me than I'd first realized. She is pure Vulcan, inherently biologically different from her almost exclusively human shipmates, and it wasn't just a cultural difference for her. She was wired differently. She also didn't quite fit in at home. Her family didn't really understand her or make any concerted effort to, much less accommodate her on her own terms, and no one ever did. We even see examples of her peers and workmates and superiors seemingly always sensing her as other. Even though she grew closest to, even loved her as a friend or shipboard family or as a romantic interest, can't ever really understand her, not completely. Certainly enough for a very close bond to form and even to romantically reciprocate. She can be accepted and loved, but she'll always be an outsider as well. And I feel that, well past using the Vulcan fiction as metaphor and allegory for some of what I experience as an autistic person, Dipole specifically rings a tone for me. More consistently with her than any other Vulcan, we see her struggle with expectations and internalized trauma, both from her experience among humans and peers and from her upbringing. Struggling so hard at first against her human crewmates in frustration at them for being so illogical and uncontrolled and impulsive, and then struggle to genuinely and earnestly understand them so she can get closer to them, so she can relate to them more easily, to share herself with them and be part of this wonderful found family she discovers herself in. Her failures sting, her spiral into self-doubt and self-destructive behavior, her surprise and initial resistance and fear in finding someone who wants to be close to them, fear of not being what they need her to be, fear of trying and failing at something so many other people just sort of take for granted, fear of rejection if someone else truly started to understand just how different her experience is. At first, using her alien nature as a shield and useful performance for keeping other people at arm's length, and then seeing it as a vulnerability that exposes her to harm that others around her aren't necessarily prey to, and finally, starting to consider it as neither of those things, just part of a whole and worthy in its own right. It's all a pretty relatable allegory for me when read that way. Hell, even her extra sensitive hearing and sensitivity to smells is relatable to me, as my autism messes with my sensory filtering, which means I'm sometimes overwhelmed by sounds and smells and you know, bright lights and stuff. Although for her, sensitive hearing is a common Vulcan trait inherent in her species, and a more acute olfactory sense is common to Vulcan females especially, so that doesn't really make her stand out amongst her other people, but yeah. The Vulcan experience isn't a perfect metaphor for autism and how I experience mine, but in a lot of ways it makes a useful touchstone. And more than once I've used examples of them as ways to try and get other people to understand my experience just a little better. It's also important to remember, if you're an outsider looking in on this, not all autistic folk share this experience. It's a spectrum of many different things, and each of us have a potentially different mix of the recipe and different strengths of the ingredients. So don't take what I've said here to apply to as a blanket to every autistic person out there that you might meet or interact with, but maybe it's a useful starting point. And to some of my fellow neurotypicals out there, have you felt the same way about Vulcans, about T'Pol, about the Klingons, with if you've got issues with anger management? What Trek or even general sci-fi species have you found relatable or useful sort of touchstone or useful allegory as a tool to understand yourself or help other people understand you a little bit better? Anyway, hopefully this has been interesting along the way. I am Blunty. I will catch you next time. I thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there. Live long and prosper.